is there any connection between beak size and penis size?
I don't think so. Only in your dreams.
Just one here. Microphone.
Can you add anything to the discussion between ruddy duck and white-headed duck in terms of?
Well, ruddy duck is very similar to that Argentine lake duck. So all that particular group of ducks have a long penis, and that's evolved because they're very keen on these forced extra pair matings. I don't actually know anything about the white-headed duck, but you know, ruddy ducks are very randy, and that's why there was a problem.
The aquatic warblers, it's only the females that do the feed the young, I think, isn't it?
Yeah.
That's because they're very, very rich
Yeah.
habitats. So otherwise, if you come from a very rich habitat, you can do it the other way around, but you can forget about the males and go up to and then have this kind of interesting mating.
I think it's just pure promiscuity in aquatic warblers. And you're absolutely right. The habitat's very rich. Females can do things on their own, so that frees them up. And really, they are. Sorry?
Frees the males up to
Yeah.
get on with.
Sorry, yeah, it frees the males up. And then the males just compete furiously with each other. It's very extreme. They also copulate for half an hour at a time, and massive testes and sperm stores. And I think what happens every time the female ends up mating, the male is just trying to load her up with sperm so that he kind of has the best chance of fathering more than one of the eggs. But the competition is so extreme that you know, it ends up in the way that she has every chick fathered by a different male in about half the nests.
So you can actually predict which species from
Sometimes the behavioural ecologists have spent a lot of time and effort trying to make predictions about levels of promiscuity, and there actually aren't many correlates that work across all birds. And the other $64,000 question that nobody's yet answered is why, you know, in something like swallows, why pair up with this male when you're just going to go and have extra pair copulations with that male? Nobody's really answered that very satisfactorily. There's been lots of answers, but they don't work across all birds. So I think that's a big unanswered question.
I was probably looking at my smartphone when you were mentioning it, but I didn't hear anything about Honey Guys, which was advertised in the Times.
You absolutely weren't concentrating, because I did explain that at the beginning. If you want a quick lesson on Honey Guys, I'll see you after.
Are there any sperm pumps in birds? So, in other words, the males remove the previous male sperm?
Well, the dunnock, which I alluded to at the end, they copulate 100 times plus a day, and the females there often pair with two males. Those two males, a bit like my buffalo weavers, that they're competing with each other. And one of the behaviours that has evolved is this cloaca pecking to remove sperm. But if you think about it, that's solicited by the female. So you think, well, why would the female worry? Well, what my colleague Nick Davis has shown is that it's in the female's interest for both males to think that they fathered some offspring, because then they will both feed the chicks. So she's complicit in this kind of game that goes on. And so the male's pecking at the cloaca, and he's waiting and watching for the female to eject sperm, presumably from the last mating, before he copulates. So you're absolutely right, that does happen. But there's not many birds that do that.
Yeah. Go on, thank you.
Do the other buffalo weavers in Africa have the same phalloid organ?
Yeah, the white-headed, I think, does. But nobody, as far as I can tell, it does. We know it has the same structure. No, the white-billed has it, but the other one with the white head, we don't know whether it has it or not. Yeah.
Do you think there will be a fourth paradigm, or is the third paradigm?
Not until I've retired. I think, almost certainly. If you just look at the way science progresses, we have different views. And of course, the individual selection paradigm has been refined as time has gone on over the last 30 years. Whether we'll see a major change, it's difficult to tell, but I suspect we will. But for the time being, that paradigm works extremely well, which is why the whole discipline of behavioural ecology has been such a huge success. But there are still unanswered questions. I think what we do need a fourth paradigm for is to tell us why females are promiscuous at all. Nobody's come up with any good ideas. So I think we need something coming in from the lateral side that, that's what it was. Because there's been a huge amount of effort trying to understand why females are promiscuous, and we failed miserably.
I think that's all the questions. But, ladies and gentlemen, when we asked Tim to speak, we didn't think he'd accept, because he very rarely does agree to speak in public. We were absolutely delighted when he did agree. And I think I speak on behalf of all of you when I say it's been a fascinating insight into the life of birds. Ladies and gentlemen, Tim Burton. So the good news is, if you've got a penis the size of a pintail's, you don't need a Porsche to pull the birds. Now, there we go. David Pearson's interest in migration dates back a long way to his early days in Suffolk before he moved to teach in Uganda and also in Kenya many years ago. He chaired the East African Records Committee for 14 years. He's written many papers and articles, and of course, 2 very, very good books indeed. Traveling widely in those countries, he studied migration and distribution, seasonality and molt of Palearctic migrants, and of course has ringed many thousands of waders and passerines, particularly, of course, at Ungulia, the famous ringing station in Kenya. And he continues to help run that now. Much has been learnt from the work at Ngulia. It's been going on now for 4 decades, and I'm delighted to say that David has agreed to give us the top-line results from his work there. So, ladies and gentlemen, David Pearson. So you can use that to change the slide, to move on, or you can move that, and then that's just there. Okay, just move it on. Yeah.
Well, I don't know quite how I can follow that last presentation. Most Eastern European passerine migrants heading to winter quarters in southern Africa break their journey on the way. And therefore, their passage through East Africa, Kenya and Tanzania, is not until November and December, the second stage of this journey. Now, over the last 40 years ago, a site was discovered in southeast Kenya at Ungulia Lodge, where this second leg of the migration could be studied. And we've worked there every autumn since that time. The lodge itself is the lodge is situated on an eastward-facing escarpment in Tsavo West National Park, and it's backed there by the Ungulia Ridge and looks out over plains to the east. The lodge, when it was opened in 1969, was equipped with 3 or 4 1.5 kilowatt floodlights to illuminate game drinking pools. And it was found there we go. And it was found that in the misty conditions that prevailed at that time of year, these lights attracted huge numbers of Palearctic migrants. small passerines. This phenomenon was discovered that year by Alec Forbes Watson, and in the coming years, in the early 1970s and on into the 1980s, Graham Backhurst and I, accompanied by small groups from Nairobi usually, visited the lodge every year at this time. We did so at new moon periods because we found that the birds were only attracted when there was an absence of moon. These large numbers of migrants required ground level mist, and mists were frequent at that time of year, occurring perhaps every other night or so, rolling in gently off the plain to the east. And as soon as the mist appeared, provided there was no moon, thousands of birds were likely to arrive. We found that some of the falls of birds that occurred at night were truly enormous. Sometimes we would estimate tens of thousands of birds grounded round the lodge the next morning. We had success with falls of birds, provided the conditions were right through from about late October, but most particularly in late November and early December, and on into early January. This is an example of the site that met us on some of these nights. Here we see hundreds of small passerines perched in the tree at night in a gap in the mist above one of the floodlights positioned there. And sitting around them, these larger birds are rollers. The species involved here are the birds involved are almost all Palearctic. With the exception of a few harlequin quails, one could say that over 99% are Palearctic birds. Mostly passerines, and the majority of them accounted for by just 3 species: marsh warbler, thrush nightingale, and eastern races of the whitethroat. Now, none of these occurs hardly in the passage movements that take place further west through the Lake Victoria area. So they are very much special to this East Kenya movement. And among the other Ngulia species are several. There are several more which just don't occur or have hardly ever occurred in Uganda. For example, the olive tree warbler, the river warbler was another quite common bird we found, usually our number 4 species at Ngulia. The Irania, and the Basra reed warbler, just to mention 3 or 4 which just don't occur on migration through Uganda, but are characteristic of these East Kenya movements. Now, among all these passerine migrants were a few Palearctic non-passerines. From time to time, we would hear herons moving past in the night, calling. We caught little bitterns fairly regularly. I would say one or two every year in the early days. Eurasian scopsow. This turned up now and again, and we caught a few crakes, especially corn crakes. Now, apart from harlequin quails, the afrotropical birds hardly feature in these falls. But but one or two species turn up at night now and again as a surprise, like this grey-headed kingfisher. Obviously they are moving at night, and we perhaps pick up one or two every year. Black and white cuckoos also were regular visitors in very small numbers. And in various crakes and rails like this Allen's gallinule. This turned up in a bush just outside the lodge veranda, sort of rolled down from the roof, and there it was, and this is what emerged. And also, occasionally, Afrotropical non-passerines. Golden pipit would be one, which would turn up from time to time, and paradise flycatcher, like this one. But as I say, over 99% of the birds that we ringed in those days, apart from the few harlequin quails, over 99% were Palearctic passerines. Now, in the early days, in the 70s and 80s, operations were sort of relatively low key compared with what they have become these days. Small Nairobi-based teams visited the lodge each year during perhaps one, perhaps two new moon periods. Most activity to start with, most trapping activity was in the morning in this bush south of the lodge. At that time, this often involved could involve encounters with game animals. Elephants were surprisingly kind to the nets. They would feed around them and scarcely touch them or damage the guys if undisturbed, and it was just a question of waiting till they moved away, maybe half an hour perhaps, sometimes before you could go and extract birds. But we never had any unfortunate incidents with elephants, although we ringed with them around all the time for years. But because of the game, we used to have to put out and take down the nets every day. We had about 8 or 10 nets in the bush in the morning for the first few hours. And that, to start with, was the main source of trapped birds for ringing. A catch of 200 or 300 a morning was then very acceptable. Ringing in a sheltered spot in the bush near the nets in the early days. Then from 1976, game numbers outside the lodge were reduced somewhat, and we decided to experiment with putting nets over the wall below the floodlights themselves at night. And this proved successful, and it was. We usually used probably 2 60-foot nets, put them up when the mist arrived, which was usually just shortly before or around midnight, and then we'd net through for about 5 hours till dawn. And this potentially gave much bigger catches than the daytime bush, many hundreds and sometimes over 1,000 birds a night. And through the late 70s and the 80s, this was indeed the main source of our birds for ringing. Now, early on, we realised that we ought to be, from early on we got into the habit of weighing and measuring birds, As far as the main 3 species were concerned, we did so selectively. The routine in the end was to process 1 in 10 of the main 3 species, but everything of the from the others. We also needed to determine as far as we could, whether birds were the age of birds, whether they were adults or first year. This meant we had to establish criteria for doing this in late autumn, November, because all the information on the subject was based on early autumn in Europe, and many birds show different wear and molt patterns later in the autumn, which make the normal autumn criteria unworkable. In the case of the marsh warbler, for example, this is an adult, and we can tell this because of this contrast between this newly grown back feathering, body feathering, newly grown in Ethiopia somewhere, and these old, worn, greyer wing and tail feathers. The fact that the wings and tail are worn doesn't by itself give you the age of the bird, because many young birds by November young marsh warblers are also pretty worn. So that's an example. We can tell that this is a young roller because it hasn't started molt. The adults will already be molting the primaries by November, so that's easy. But also, that short, rounded outer tail feather is typical of a young bird, whereas in an adult, the outer tail feather is the longest feather, I think, but it's narrow and black-tipped. So quite a different shaped outer tail feather. So those are just 2 examples of aging. But we worked out, anyway, how to age quite a lot of the species we were handling at that time. And we found that, unlike what you tend to find when you're ringing autumn migrants in early autumn in Europe, say, we were getting quite a lot of adults, something like 40% generally speaking. So it wasn't just young birds that were coming down to these lights, it was adults as well. Now, as I said, when conditions were suitable, i.e. with low mist and no moon, falls of birds in autumn occurred from the end of October through to the beginning of January, with a peak at the end of November and beginning of December. We also thought that maybe something similar would happen in spring on the northward migration, which occurs principally in April through Kenya. And we did visit the lodge during those early years quite a number of times, but with relatively little success. And this is because, mainly because, in other words, we didn't often encounter a fall of birds at the lights. And this is mainly because the weather conditions are different. Whereas in November and December, you get these nice low mists drifting in on a light easterly breeze off the plain, if not every night, maybe 2 nights out of 3. In April, a breeze tended to get up. The trade winds have in fact switched round, and a southerly breeze tends to get up, and if there is any mist there, it tends to blow away in the hours after midnight. So conditions are not good for producing falls of birds in April. But on a few occasions it did work, and we did get enough of I think on about 4 or 5 occasions, we got a decent catch, and we were able to establish what the species involved were, and they were surprisingly different from those in autumn. In the autumn, you can see that the main 3 species here, with river warbler probably number 4, willow warbler and Irania, and then just relatively small numbers of the other things. Whereas in spring, again, whitethroat, the most abundant this time, thrush nightingale and marsh warbler also there. But look at this, the second most abundant species in spring was sedge warbler, which we never saw at all in the autumn, or if at all, almost as a rarity. And another one, great reed warbler, quite a few in spring. Again, we usually used to catch about 1 or 2 a season in autumn. Redback shrike must be much better represented in spring, and willow warblers. So, an interesting difference in pattern, due, I think, probably to several species here which migrate further west in autumn, like redback shrike and great reed warbler, for example, and sedge warbler, which probably are performing a loop migration which brings them in spring back through Kenya, back through eastern Kenya. By 1990, we had ringed we'd ringed over 100,000 birds at the lodge, and we were accumulating quite a few recoveries and beginning to pick up one or two control one or two European rings. In fact, we had movements. In fact, we had recoveries from as far west as birds from as far west as Belgium, east to Russia, and to the south of the lodge down to Zimbabwe. From 1990, though, there were 1 or 2 major changes in our operation. Firstly, team size. We had, over the last 2 decades, we've usually had a team of about, at least 15 people operating there over the main moon period every year, including many participants from Europe and outside Kenya. And the Kenyan ringers themselves have mostly been mostly represented by a lively young group from Nairobi Museum. Secondly, the day netting operation shifted from the southern bush behind the lodge, partly because we were losing it to clearance for one reason or another, and we moved the daytime operations to the front of the lodge, and over the last, since then, each session we've had lines of nets set up in the bush here below the lighted area under the lights. So this gives the possibility of picking up lots of birds as they move away from this lighted area immediately after dawn. So since, and this has worked very well, these lines of nets, we're able to maintain them in the bush. We don't have to put them up and take them down every day. We're able to maintain them through the whole session. These, of course, are opened at first light for the dawn catch after the night netting operations, which use only a couple of nets, have been brought to an end. So this is a typical scene about an hour after first light, clearing these lines of, extracting from these lines of nets. Birds are bagged and conveyed on poles up to the ringing site, this shelter at the lodge. their ringing starts immediately, and it's carried out at, usually if it's a busy morning, we have 3 tables operating, 3 ringing tables operating, with a scribe and hopefully 3 fast ringers at each table. And these birds from this initial catch, it's very busy for the first hour and a half at the nets, and from that catch, which can often number over 1,000 birds, those are dealt with and released generally by about 9 o'clock, the last ones. But in the meantime, they're sort of organised up at the ringing centre. They're organised on poles and dealt with strictly in the order in which they come up from the nets. Night netting operations have continued much as they were in the late 70s and 80s, with a couple of nets outside, with birds being taken from them continuously. So you have, if it's busy, you have 2 extractors on each net. Because the lodge's own lighting has become very inferior in recent years, we have invested in a couple of our own 1 kilowatt lamps, which we set up on tripods. You'll see one there. Another extractor's view of nets of birds hitting the net at night. It can actually be as much as 2 people can manage to continuously clear and bag these birds. Sometimes they have to call for an extra extractor or an extra carrier, but it can be that busy. Hence the need for no more than 2 nets at night. So birds are ferried at night from the nets and assembled on these poles, organised on these poles in strict time order, awaiting processing. And we set up at least 2 tables within the lodge. And on a busy night, we can be ringing there from about midnight until 4:30. When these days, operations are wound down so that we've cleared all the birds before we think of going out to do the post-dawn operation. At night, we ring under these tungsten lamps. To use strip lights would be absolutely fatal with all the insects that are around. The lodge is inundated, I might say, much of the time by insects as much as by birds, although this has decreased a lot in recent decades. Sometimes that tungsten light is not enough, and the ringing table can be practically buried under small insects. We sometimes have had to operate under a mosquito net or just stop. These are mainly small moths and sometimes termites, occasionally nastier things. Another view of the trees outside the lodge on a typical night when they're literally full of small birds. Mixture of passerines there with rollers, and a group of cattle egrets in the background there, which have got tired of circling the lodge in the mist and decided to pitch down into the trees and join the rest. Up to 2000, up to the present, we've ringed over 500,000 birds at Tungulia. And this has given something like 230 recoveries, which actually it's not nearly as many as it would have been if we'd been ringing this number of migrants in West Africa, because most of our birds are disappearing off to remote places. And the chances of recoveries are fairly low. But we, as I say, we've had nearly 230 recoveries from over 40 different countries. And I can show you some of those recoveries. Before I come to that, this shows the annual catch of birds at the lodge starting from 1970 through to 213. And you can see that in the first 2 decades, where the best catching was at night, even then we were picking up 5,000 to 10,000 birds a season. And that actually represents probably only something like 15 nights of manning at the lodge. Over the last 2 decades, we probably manage at least 15 nights in the main session, and then perhaps another minor moon session earlier or later. So perhaps an average of 20 nights a season. But you can see that we now reckon to catch about 15,000 to 20,000 birds on those 20 nights. The big jump in 1995 is due to the more efficient catching operation in the bush. These are recoveries of marsh warblers. The red dots represent sites where birds were ringed that were subsequently controlled by us at Angulia. The green dots represent sites from which our own ringed birds, where our own ringed birds have been reported. You see that marsh warblers, in fact, from the whole European and West Asian range, funnel through this eastern Kenyan route, and at Angulia we get birds from east and west. Most recoveries, of course, from where other ringers are most active, in places like Belgium and Germany and Czechoslovakia, a few in Russia. Migration takes most of these birds through the Arabian Peninsula, clearly. We have this big bunch of recoveries, many of them, regrettably I suppose, from hunters. In spring, we also get recoveries from the Oman, but only in spring, which does suggest that here through Arabia, we might have a little sort of loop migration, birds coming this way in autumn, and then back this way in spring, further east in spring. Quite a few recoveries of marsh warblers down in the southern African winter quarters, Zambia, Malawi, Mozambique, and Zimbabwe. Sprossa, or I use the German, which we always do at Angulia, but I should say thrush nightingale. Again, quite a few recoveries from northern and eastern